This video is sponsored by Game Toppers. Turn your own kitchen or dining room table into a premium portable game solution at a fraction of the cost. Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 758. Today we're going to take a look at Star Wars The Clone Wars Pandemic System game. So like I think last year's World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King Pandemic System game, it's a pandemic style game in some of the mechanics, but themed in another kind of universe. So obviously this is during the Clone Wars era of Star Wars. What you're going to be doing is taking multiple different heroes, running them around to different planets, trying to sort of tamp down the droid army, as well as go on to lots of different quests and missions, and eventually defeat kind of a big bad, the main villain of kind of the given setup there. Now there's not really scenarios per se, but there's 4 different villains. But beyond that, there's also decent stack of kind of mission cards that you have to go through to sort of complete before you can sort of unlock the final mission and battle the big bad, the big villain. So let's go down to the table and take a look at it, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think. Okay, so here's what your table might look like set up for the game. A few things you can notice here: there are different planets that you will be moving around to using your various different figures here. So here is the Obi-Wan figure, and the Obi-Wan comes with a special card that gives you a special ability there that you can see. Every character has a free action that you can do on your turn. And here we've got Mace Windu as another example there. And you can take a look at his miniature here, like so. And there are 7 different heroes that you can take control over, and each player will take over 1 hero. If you're playing solo, you can control multiple. One nice thing with the solo game is it gives you a little token that you can place kind of in or on the card of the character that's whose current turn it is. Because one thing I found, not just with a pandemic game, is with any kind of sort of co-op game that you can play solo, is you kind of forget whose turn it is sometimes. Like, who just went? And this is kind of a nice way to kind of remind you, so you can move this along the table to remind you who actually is kind of the active hero at the moment. And there's a bunch of other cards and stuff. You can see some of the other miniatures over on that side of the table, some of the different villains. And speaking of villains, you'll have the villain card up there at the top. They each have their own specific deck, so I just put Darth Maul out there. You can see you've got a Dooku deck, a Ventress deck, as well as a General Grievous deck. And they have their own cards with the different special abilities and so on. So here you can see they kind of start on one side, and then once you kind of unlock the final mission, you'll flip them over, and they give you some extra little instructions and kind of a final mission or group of missions, and they're pretty asymmetric. There's a whole bunch of kind of different ways that they kind of react, which I'll show you in a minute. And speaking of missions, if I just pop over here, your goal is to go through a stack of these mission cards, and you can see it kind of shows you a little map of the board on the side there. So that gives you the place where you've got to go and do the mission, and then it has kind of the requirements here. So you need the assault troopers, that's the little red helmet in that one, or you need the stealth troopers on the other one. And they give you little tokens here to kind of remind you where that mission is. So you've got to go to that spot to go to the corresponding mission and then take an action to try to complete it. Now, once you get through the stack, then of course you unlock the final mission with the villain. Now there is a good size stack of cards there that you can do. So depending on the difficulty, you will give yourself 3, 4, 5, 6 of the missions to complete. The more missions to complete, the more difficult it is, obviously, to finish the game. And you can even go beyond 6 if you want to get, like, I can't remember what they call it, like Super Jedi Master level or something. And then you're going to go through and complete those. In the meantime, while you're trying to go to these different mission objective points here on the map, then you've also got to kind of tamp down the Trade Federation droids. They're going to come out. These are these little miniatures there, like so. And you've also got these blockade droid ships that will come into play. And then, of course, where's the Darth Maul one here? So let's say we're playing against Darth Maul. This guy will be kind of cruising around the board, causing havoc. And each of the different villains behave differently in how they kind of interact with the board or interact with the heroes and so on. Now, in each player's sort of play area, they'll have their card representing who they are, as well as a hand of cards. Now, there's no hidden hand of cards like regular Pandemic. All of these are face up, so everybody can kind of discuss what everybody has, since it's a co-op game. You also have player aids here. These are the different 4 actions you can do on the game. You can shuffle these up, and it tells you where to start your hero. So in this place, Maybe Ayla started on Kashyyyk, or maybe somebody started on Naboo or something like that. And then you have a player right here. So on your turn, you're going to take 4 actions. Now before you take actions, you're actually going to ready cards, because in this game you don't really discard cards to do anything like other Pandemic games. You're actually just going to exhaust them or tap them. And then at the start of your turn, you're going to untap any cards that you have exhausted. And then you do the 4 actions. The 4 actions are pretty simple. You can move along one of these kind of lanes here from one planet to the next. That costs you 1 of your actions. If you have a ship card, one of these with this little icon here, or another player at the same location has one of these, before you move you can tap that, and instead of moving 1 spot you can move 2. And so you can use that on other players' turns to help them move along. And you can't stack those. You can't, like, you know, tap 3 of them to give them 6 movement or anything like that. The next thing you can do is you can attack. And here, let's just zoom in a little tighter on this spot here. So let's say Obi-Wan here was in here and they want to do an attack action. We can see we've got the 3 droids and then the 1 ship there. Now it costs 1 damage to destroy the droids and 2 to destroy the ship. But if there's ever a ship there, you've got to kill it first. And the ship will prevent you from doing any missions. If this was a mission planet here, you wouldn't be able to take an action to do the mission until you got rid of that droid ship. Or if there happened to be a villain there as well, then you can't do the action to sort of complete the mission like that. But let's reverse out of there. So let's say you want to do an attack. Well, in this game, unlike other Pandemic games, there's an attack die. And this dice is used for more than attack. What you do is you would roll this die, and then you're looking for these symbols here, and these are sort of the amount of damage. These are the amount of successes here that you will do. So you have 2 successes. Well, in this case, since we have to kill the ship first, we need 2 damage to kill the ship, and so we could do that and kill that and be done. Now what happens though when you're done attacking is the amount of figures left there will do damage back to you. So if we just killed the ship, we'd have 3 damage coming back to Obi-Wan. Now when you take damage in this game, you have to discard cards. So if we were taking 3 damage, maybe I would choose 3 cards, maybe I could choose all 3 of these, and then I'd have to discard those. Now anytime that you do take damage, if you or another Jedi on your planet has one of these cards here with the little sort of transport thing there, they can tap one of these to prevent 1 damage. And again, you can do that on other players' turn to kind of help protect them. But any damage that you don't prevent, you're going to have to discard cards equal to that damage. Now you will also take damage, let's take a look here at this die, if you ever roll one of these sort of damage symbols there, if it'll focus. So in this case, if I had rolled this, I'd have 3 successes, so I'd be able to kind of do 3 hit points worth of damage to that spot. But no matter what, no matter if I cleared everything off or not, I'd still have 1 damage coming back to me, which again could be prevented, but otherwise you have to discard a card. Now there's a way to boost attacks, and that's where these types of cards come in here. You have the stealth cards, and then you have the assault cards. And in the case of an attack, you have to pick 1 type of those cards to exhaust to do that. So let's go back to our first example here where we rolled 2 successes. So that would get rid of the ship. Now we need to get 3 more done. Well, we could exhaust 3 of these, and those would each do 1 more damage. But if we only had, let's say we didn't have those 3, we only had these 2 here, and we only had 1 of these. Again, you have to choose the type that you want to apply. You're kind of deciding what kind of attack. Do I want to do a stealth attack or assault attack? So I could tap these 2, and then I would get rid of 2 more droids. That would leave 1 left. But let's say the other player there that was there also had the matching type that we decided to use, either assault or stealth. Then they can also exhaust a card to help out on the attack. Even though it's not their turn, they can always kind of help out. But again, you still have to stick to the certain type. And then you clear those off. Again, if there's anybody left, they'll do damage back to you. The villains here will most of the time have hit points, so you need to do that much damage to them. And there's no like carrying damage over. You have to do it all at once. So even if you had like a little bit of damage left over, you couldn't like apply it to the villain, because it's going to basically heal that damage up as soon as your turn's over. So you have to do it all at once. And if you do enough to the villain, they're going to go off the board, and they have a deck of cards that will bring them on the board or move them around if they're already on the board. Now, before we talk about missions, you also have the free actions here that you can do that don't cost you 1 of your 4 actions. So, example, Ayla can move up to 2 planets for free. Obi-Wan's got an interesting one here. So you can draw 4 squad cards. That's what these are called, by the way, squad cards. And then place 3 of them on the bottom of the deck in a random order. And of course, you keep the other one. So there's all kinds of abilities from the different heroes here, like Anakin. He's always angry. So you get a free action. You can do an attack. You can use any of your cards as if they were the assault cards. So you can kind of spend a bunch of cards there and do a bunch of attacks. So they all have their kind of different focus. So in addition to the free action, the last action besides doing a mission is to go over here and draw a card off the squad deck. So that's an action to draw a new card. You have at most 7 cards in your hand. If you ever go above that, then you have to discard down to 7 immediately. The other cards in there, though, you can do are these kind of ally cards. So this is a trustworthy figure here, Chancellor Palpatine. He's an ally card. These you can always play on anybody else's turn, and then you just do it and just do whatever it says. And so there's some nice cards in here. And one of the neat things, for example, is like the missions up here sometimes will tell you to go fish out certain ally cards because it kind of thematically implies that you're like rescuing those allies and stuff like that. So there's some neat interactions there. But to do a mission, let's take a closer look at the mission cards. So here's one of the example missions, Battle of Kashyyyk. You'll put the marker on Kashyyyk, of course. And this has an ability, when you draw it, you fill Kashyyyk up with 2 droids. So we'll just put 2 droids right on there if there aren't any already on there. And then when you do this mission, this shows you the types of cards that you can do. So in this case, you can only use the assault cards. And it works a similar way. You'll roll this. You'll apply, any of the matching symbols. So let's look at a different one here. Like, for example, this one here allows you to do the assault ones and the ships. You can actually use to increase whatever the success value of that is. So you roll that, and then after you roll it, then you can decide as a collective, if you've got more than one of your heroes on that location, you can apply the appropriate cards and then defeat the mission there. Now, if you roll and then you decide, okay, we can't defeat it, so we're not going to exhaust any cards, you're going to take this damage back to you. If you do defeat the mission, then you're going to take this much damage. Sometimes there'll be more than one of these if you succeed. And once you succeed, you'll discard this, draw a new mission card to fill it in. If it's the last mission card, then these 2 tokens here will basically go to the same planet, and you'll just have that one mission left, because sometimes the villain cards will interact with the mission sites. So it'll interact with that same site multiple times. Once you do the last one, then you'll flip over the villain card here, which is this guy here. We'll flip that over to the other side, and it'll usually give you kind of a mission or multiple missions, and there's all kinds of different things here. So for Ventress, you need 10, and you can use these 2 here. So that's kind of the idea of the game. You go through and do different missions, and then you unlock kind of the final mission. Let's just talk a little bit more about some of the different villains before I talk about kind of how the villains activate. So here's Ventress, and she's kind of like the starter villain in a way. Again, each villain has their own deck, and if you see this little symbol there, it tells you to put this little marker on top of the deck. So before you draw the villain card, it tells you to kind of check this condition here. So it says if Ventress is on the mission planet, again, one of these with one of those tokens there, then you're going to advance threat. We'll talk about threat in a minute, but you don't want to advance the threat. And then after you kind of resolve any of those, then you'll flip over the top card of the villain deck and do what it says. And then after you do that, then you're going to resolve what's called the invasion step, which is kind of similar to other pandemics. But after every hero goes, so a hero will go, and then you'll resolve the villain step and then the invasion step, and then the next hero will go, resolve the villain step and then the invasion step, and so on. And so Ventress, what she tries to do, I just want to give you a brief overview because it's one of the cool parts of the game, is she'll always try to go to wherever the mission planets are, and she'll try to basically get there and advance the threat quicker. So that's kind of her bag there. Darth Maul is very interesting because he will kind of bounce around the map trying to avoid the heroes in a way, but in the meantime, his cards in his deck will have him build up his power, and then every time he hits 5 power, you're going to advance the threat, and then this will reset to 0. But anytime you defeat him, he's going to lose 3 power, so you can kind of keep his power down, otherwise it's going to cycle up, and it can cycle up pretty quickly. And then once you flip it over, you'll just keep this on the same spot, and you have to go and kind of defeat him, and his value is going to be, you need to do 7 points plus the threat value there, and then that's going to make it harder to defeat him, so he's kind of building up power over time. Now Grievous also is very interesting. He's going to use this little tracker, but not until you level him up. His deck is going to make you invade planets faster. We'll talk about invasion in just a second, but once you unlock his thing, you're going to flip this over, and then you're going to have to defeat multiple missions here, like this. So you got to be in the same spot as Grievous, and then do this mission, and then that mission, and that one, and then that one. So he's going to have to do multiple missions. But again, his deck is going to force the invasion step to happen a lot quicker. And then Dooku finally is the kind of the hardest one, or the biggest bad. He will start out on the board with him, and the Ventress miniature will both be on the board, moving around. And then over time, he's going to start to add actually the other villains. And then the villains are going to move around and try to get at the heroes and do damage to the heroes and all that stuff. So there's kind of a lot going on with that. And then eventually you have to defeat Dooku multiple times to defeat him. So he's kind of a smorgasbord of activity going on there. So the villain phase will activate, and then we're going to do the invasion step. So up here, you can see this deck of cards, and you can see this tracker here. It starts at 2, and in every villain deck, there's one card that's going to advance this. And what happens at the end of the turn is you're going to draw cards equal to that number from this deck, and then you're going to put droids out on these planets, you know, on the same planet that's depicted on the card that you just drew, just like Pandemic. This is just like Pandemic, this part. And then when the villain deck sort of advances it, you'll draw the bottom one, put it on top, shuffle these back together. You'll put 3 droids on that planet. And you draw some of these to kind of seed the board, and you have some droids out on the planet. And then you just kind of keep going through that. So every turn, you're going to start to draw more and more of these invasions, and then with Grievous, you're going to draw even more invasions. So this is going to be a bigger part of the game with Grievous on the board. Now, you can, of course, only have 3 droids active on any planet there. If you have to draw and put a 4th one on there, instead, you'll put one of these blockade ships. Anytime you put a blockade ship out like that, you've got to advance the threat. So the threat is how you lose the game. This is the only way you lose the game, but there's a lot of things that interact with it. So again, every time you put a battle droid ship out, this will go up. Anytime you have to put a ship out, or you have to put a droid out, and you don't have any left in the supply, the threat will go up. Anytime a villain activation or special ability causes threat to go up, it goes up. And if this somehow miracle happens where this gets all the way to the right and you haven't lost the game or beat the game already, if you have to advance the invasion step anymore, then the threat will go up instead. And that's how you lose the game. If this ever gets to the Emperor spot, then you're going to lose the game. If you defeat all of the missions in the mission deck, and then to finally defeat the villain mission, then you win the game. And that pretty much sums up the game. We'll go back to my talking head. Okay, so that was the Clone Wars Pandemic game. Let's just go through my pillars of review. I've played this at 1, 2, and 3 players. I haven't played it with 4 yet. And you know, if you had to pin me down, I would say it didn't really matter to me, actually. I really enjoyed it solo, actually. And I like playing it with, it's not really that different playing with people. But with the solo game, you actually control 2 characters anyway. So it's kind of like the same idea. And like I mentioned, they give you the nice token to keep track of, you know, which character's turn it is, which is actually super helpful, especially for me. But player count doesn't really matter because the game kind of auto scales up anyway with kind of the number of activations. They're always, you know, hero, villain, hero, villain. Play time, I think the box says an hour, yeah. And yeah, it's about an hour. It could go a little bit longer maybe, or a little bit shorter, kind of just depending on how the game shakes out, but it's always going to be like 45 minutes to a little over an hour, no matter what. But some of that's going to depend on the number of missions that you do, because the difficulty is baked into the number of missions. So if you have to do more missions, you're theoretically going to be able to you know, have the game last longer, unless you get your face kicked in at the beginning and you lose quickly. But you know, so there's that. Now obviously the big comparison in the last pillar is to the other Pandemic games, and specifically to the Wrath of the Lich King Pandemic game, because this is most like that, and arguably the biggest departure from the Pandemic system while still retaining the Pandemic sort of label. Although there's a couple others that might give this one a run for its money in terms of that part of it. But the really, really neat thing about this is it kind of fixes the issues I had with Wrath of the Lich King. Now, I really enjoyed Wrath of the Lich King. Is a lot of fun. I did a review of it. You can go look for the link on that. The one sort of criticism I had about it was it felt like it kind of needed some more varieties or expansion was kind of the mission idea. That was all pretty stagnant there. There wasn't really a lot involved. There's a couple of different missions, and you kind of went and did it, and you had to kind of spend the cards similar to this, but in like certain orders and stuff like that. And that was cool. And the card abilities and the way the mechanics and the way you use the cards is similar in this game, but it's a little bit different. Where you have this cool thing where you kind of build up a set of cards and you kind of exhaust them, and you want to retain them for certain, activities that are going to happen. But then instead of like ever discarding them for anything, when you take damage, then you have to discard them. And so that, it's simple, but it's like that's a really kind of neat aspect to the game, is the way these cards actually work. Like, it's not just that you're still kind of building sets like you do want for the original Pandemic and lots of the Pandemic games, but they act as sort of not a defensive mechanism, but they act as sort of a buffer to the damage that you take. Now, if you don't have any cards in your hand and you take damage, then nothing happens. You don't have any cards to discard. And there's actually some strategies you can play with some of the different characters to kind of go and kind of clean up some of the more combat-oriented characters like Mace Windu and Anakin and stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting idea there in terms of the space of like how you can play around. The other really interesting part of it, though, is how if you're in the same location, you can both or multiple people can spend that same type of card, whether you're doing a mission or a combat and that kind of thing, or you can spend cards to protect the other player. And that's a really kind of neat part of it. And it just really improves upon the whole like mission idea in the Wrath of the Lich King thing, where you have this very cooperative feeling thing. Like you actually are there physically working together, spending cards together. And it really reminds me of a game called Defenders of the Realm, which is super inspired by Pandemic. And it really had that idea where you would come together, you kind of fight the big bad in that game, and then everyone would kind of pool their cards together. So you didn't always have this idea of, I forget the role in Pandemic, of like having to go and like shuffle cards off to this person and make sure they have enough cards and they can be the one to go off and cure the disease or fight the thing. This is like, okay, we have them together and we can meet together and use them together. And that just adds to kind of the teamwork vibe of the game, which is really, really cool. I really like that. So you have that whole dynamic going on. And the ally cards are really cool in this. So to me, I think it's mostly to do with the theme, but the ally cards, and those are like the special effect cards and stuff like that, are really neat and thematically kind of tied to the game and stuff. So like that and the hero abilities and the different villain abilities, they seem like they did a really good job with trying to do stuff that made sense for the characters in the movies and the TV shows and all that stuff. So that's really neat. The other part of it that's really cool is all of the different missions that you have, because you have a decent stack of missions, and some of them are harder than others. Some of them will give you better benefits when you defeat them. They'll do different things, they'll have like different combos and different reveal abilities and different things that, like, there's one mission was like once you move here, you're stuck. You have to do this mission, so you don't want to go in there at all and try to chance it. You got to go in there, because once you go in there, you have to sit there until you defeat the mission and won't let the Jedi leave. And so there's just a whole bunch of those. And so that variety that was kind of missing out of Wrath of the Lich King is there. And that, again, just adds to the theme and the immersion and all that stuff. And that's really cool. And having the different villains is really neat. Because, it's kind of like this whole mix and match plug and play thing. You've got different missions you can do. You've got different villains that will kind of combo that up. So the variety replayability aspect of it is there. And so that's just really neat. And again, just kind of going back to my previous point, the thematics of all the villains, it works really well. I really like how you have this other concern. Because the one thing about this system, it's really cool. I mean, it works really well. It's great. I think that they're applying this to different IPs. I know there's like a cynical vein of like, Asmodee bought Z-Man, who bought Fantasy Flight, and then, now we've got the Star Wars license, and so they're just going to pump out this junk, this crap, But this is like a really great example of kind of the good stuff that can come out of it, because you have a game that's going to be accessible and familiar and easy to play, even for somebody who's never played Pandemic. I could see a family picking this up at, wherever store, and being able to get into this game. It's just a couple of pages of the rule books. There's a watch it played video that you can go watch, and be able to get into this and have a good time with a family that enjoys kind of the Star Wars stuff. And so because of all of these corporate forces coming together, now we have a product like this, which I think is really, really fun. And I enjoy playing it as somebody that plays tons of games, just because it's got all of those kind of things that'll keep me coming back to it, with the different missions juggling up, the different villains, the mix and match of the heroes and all that stuff. So everything is very well interesting and cool. And the kind of circling back to my original point here, it's like you've got your sort of Pandemic system. They've got to go and squash down the droids, or go and squash down the diseases in the original game, and then kind of juggle that around. And so you're just doing this big balancing act on the map. But this feels like it's like comes with an expansion or so, because you've got to go juggle all of the stuff on the map. You've got to go juggle the different villain abilities. You've got to juggle the different missions. And so you have to kind of move around and take into effect all of those different things that are happening. Because if you go too hard on the missions, you're going to let the invasion stuff get out of control, and you're going to start to have all these blockade droid ships show up, and then your threat's just going to go up that way. But if you don't deal with the villain directly, then the threat's going to go up on its own accord and in its little special abilities. So there is a cool sort of, again, the whole teamwork vibe, the balancing act of you go do this, I'll go do that, you guys focus on these missions, and juggling that as the new missions come up and as the villains, kind of changes their tactics and all that stuff. So it's just a really, really solid game. I definitely recommend. I think this is just like the perfect sort of Star Wars game for people that don't necessarily play like a ton of games. Like Star Wars Rebellion would be the one for people that play tons of games, or Imperial Assault or X-Wing or something. The hobbyist types of folks. And you have other games, like the Star Wars Risk game that came out that's pretty good, with whatever the rules changes that they came out with. But it has more of a family type of game. And this to me is kind of like right in that kind of sweet spot where it's a great solid game with lots of replayability, but it's going to hit that family sweet spot where, an adult with kids can kind of show them like, well, this is how we do this. And the kids will just get it, I think. So I would definitely take a look at it. I highly recommend it. I had a ton of fun with it. It's one of my favorite sort of Pandemic system games that they've come out with. So there you go. Thanks.